Hello, welcome to InfoFire, the fireside chat series from Information Matters. InfoFire brings visionaries and experts from across different domains to share their stories and perspectives on a chosen topic. Each episode is a conversation between an expert and your host. I am Shalini, your host for this series. In today's episode of InfoFire, I am in conversation with Dr. Vint, an internet pioneer. The topic of our conversation is AI the future of everything? I have a formidable task today. How does one introduce a legend? It's a cliche to say Vint needs no introduction. True, it's a commonplace expression. Still, the expression has neither lost its original meaning nor power. Widely known as one of the fathers of the internet, Cerf is the co-designer of the TCP/IP protocols and the internet's architecture. The internet has been one of the marvels of technology that has changed the world in myriad ways. So it's but natural that awards and honors galore for an internet pioneer. In 1997, President Clinton presented the US National Medal of Technology to Sir and Robert Kahn for founding and developing the internet. Sir also was given the Prince of Asturias Award for Science and Technology in 2002, along with Lawrence Roberts, Robert Kahn, and Tim Berners-Lee. Kahn and Cerf were named the ACM Alan M. Turing Award recipients in 2004 for their work on Internet protocols. The Turing Award is called the Nobel Prize of Computer Science. In 2005, President George Bush awarded Cerf and Kahn the Presidential Medal of Freedom for their work. The medal is the highest civilian award the United States gives its citizens. In 2008, Cerf and Kahn, along with Victor McCuskey, received the Japan Prize, one of the most prestigious awards in science and technology after the Nobel Prize. In 2013, Vint received the inaugural Queen Elizabeth Prize for Engineering along with Tim Berners-Lee, Robert Kahn, and Louis Puzzi. In 2023, Cerf received the Marconi Society Lifetime Achievement Award. The list of awards and honors that our guest of today has received are too innumerable to catalog here. Vint Cerf received his bachelor's degree in mathematics from Stanford University. He then worked for IBM as a systems engineer before going back to school, the University of California at Los Angeles, to earn a master's degree and a doctorate degree in computer science. He then returned to Stanford, joining the computer science and electrical engineering faculty. His tryst with communication protocols began when he worked on the project to write the network control program for the ARPANET, Advanced Research Projects Agency Network of DARPA. Let us now begin our chat with Vint Cerf. Hi Vint, welcome to InfoFire, the five-side chat series from Information Matters. Some people change the world and touch our lives. However, we rarely get to meet and listen to someone who has literally changed the world and the way we live. Today is one of those moments. I'm in conversation with Dr. Vinton Cerf, who co-designed the TCP/IP protocol, the central piece of the internet infrastructure, along with Bob Kahn and others, and is considered one of the fathers of the internet. It's an honor and a daunting privilege to have this fireside chat with the legendary Vint Cerf. Thank you so much, Vint, for this privilege. I am humbled by your nice gesture.
Well, I'm delighted to be here, Shalini. You always ask good questions. I hope I have adequate answers to them. But the conversation is important because the internet has become such a global presence, and it increasingly plays an important role in all of our lives. And so talking about it and its history and its implications and its future seem to me very timely. So I'm happy to have this opportunity.
Thank you so much once again. Vint, you have been a force multiplier for the coming of the internet society. You have had a front row seat to the unfolding of the AI era, right from your graduate student days at UCLA in the late 1960s to fathering and steering the internet at DARPA during the 1970s to present as the chief internet evangelist at Google. If you were to pick five significant breakthroughs in the last 5 decades, which one would you pick?
Well, I'm not sure whether it will come out to exactly five, but let me pick a few important milestones. One of them, of course, was the publication of the description of the internet in 1974. That was in IEEE Transactions on Communications. That surely has to be one major milestone. The second major milestone is the November 22nd, 1977, when we did a demonstration of three different packet switch nets, a mobile packet radio net, packet satellite net, and the original ARPANET as three networks of the internet, and showed that this technology actually worked, that TCP/IP was doing what it was supposed to do. The next big milestone comes in 1983, January 1st, when we actually turned the internet on operationally. So it is then functioning for, at that time, an academic community that was supported and sponsored by the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. The next milestones come in the mid-1980s, and I don't think I can pick a precise date, but I can say during this period of around 1986 to 1990, we saw three additional major backbone networks created to interconnect with those that were already present. So the National Science Foundation built the NSFNet backbone. The Department of Energy built the Energy Sciences Network. And NASA built the NASA Science Internet. And they all ran with TCP/IP, and they all interconnected and formed a major network in the United States. And during that same time frame, there were efforts in Europe, especially in Northern Europe, to implement TCP/IP, in spite of the fact that the popular protocol that was thought to be the future was called the Open Systems Interconnection Protocol, which was part of the International Standards Organization effort to duplicate what the internet intended to do. And so they were in competition with each other. I would say that the next major milestone shows up in two pieces. In December of 1991, Tim Berners-Lee, who was at CERN at the time, released the World Wide Web. And to be honest, not too many people noticed that event, but there were two people at the National Center for Supercomputer Applications, Mark Andreessen and Eric Mina, who looked at the browser, the text-based browser that Tim had released, and said, wonder what would happen if they made a graphical user interface for it. And so they wrote a program called Mosaic, which offered a graphical user interface to the World Wide Web. And that caught everyone's attention. Many downloads of the open source Mosaic were offered. And at that point, we're talking about a major transformation of the view of the internet, and rapid and growing interest in it. In fact, the interest was so great that I would say the next significant milestone comes with the commercialization of the World Wide Web in the form of Netscape Communications, which opens its doors for business in 1994. And at that point, I was back at MCI, and we decided we were going to build an MCI mall, an online shopping mall. And so I went to Netscape Communications and ordered $7 million worth of licenses to use their server and browser software. And so, and that company went public in 1995, and the stock went through the roof, and the dot boom was on. And so that's an important milestone, because for the next 5 or 6 years, enormous quantities of capital flowed into anything that looked like it was part of the internet. And then that sort of came a cropper in April of 2000, when many of those startup companies ran out of capital and didn't have a revenue stream to keep going. And so the dot bust happens. in April of 2000. Now, I realize we're over 5 milestones here, but I think that these are important milestones to keep in mind. So the dot bust happens, but the internet continues to grow. Commercial routers have been available since roughly 1984, so we're already almost 20 years into, or at least 15 years into commercialization of the hardware and software. And I would say that the next big milestone in the 2000s comes in 2007 with the introduction of the iPhone from Apple. And here what we see is the conjunction of two independent technologies that had been running side by side, but without any interconnection for many years. The first handheld mobile phone call was made in 1973, literally April 3rd or so of 1973, roughly the same time frame when Bob Kahn and I started designing the internet. And so the notion of handheld communication and the internet are sort of start in parallel, and they keep running in parallel. But with the iPhone, suddenly mobile telephony and the internet become hypergolically connected. And so at that point, suddenly people have access to the internet from anywhere that they can get a mobile phone signal. And of course, somewhere in between all of these things is the introduction of the desktop and the laptop and the pad and then the mobile. But I would say the 2007 milestone is incredibly significant. And if we now try to go from 2007 to the present, I would say that, in fact, I've left out an important milestone with the introduction of optical fiber networking, which comes in the early 1980s. That too was a huge enabler, and it continues to be so. There's an enormous amount of construction going on in this time frame of undersea cable interconnecting the continents together. And I would say that the next big milestone in this from 2007 comes with the launch of the low Earth orbiting satellites, Starlink being among the first to start populating the low Earth orbits. And others have come, OneWeb, for example. That is a major transformation as well, because suddenly we have inter-satellite connectivity, which potentially is faster, ironically, than going over the undersea cables. And the reason for that is that the speed of light in the vacuum is 186,000 miles a second. Speed of light in a fiber is actually only about half that. And so going all the way up to a low orbiting satellite and hopping through the satellites and hopping down to the ground again might actually be faster than going through an optical fiber cable. So latency now becomes an important metric in addition to speed of transmission. So that brings us pretty close to the present. And I would say that we're now awaiting the next major milestone. And I would guess that the one that would be on everyone's mind, and perhaps we'll talk more about that, is machine learning and artificial intelligence and the application of new computing technologies in order to build these almost, let's say, well, certainly capable devices of interacting in human discourse in a way which is astonishing in many cases, and then from time to time it breaks. The last point I'll make is a milestone that has not happened yet. And, well, there are two. One of them is the introduction of quantum computing, which is still in its very, very early stages. But if there are algorithms that can run faster than conventional computing, it may make an enormous difference in solving optimization problems that otherwise are out of reach, computationally out of reach. And the other development, which is also on the cusp of fruition, is the introduction of the interplanetary backbone network. Using a new suite of protocols other than TCP/IP, they will be part of the Artemis missions that are being launched, the first one of which has already been launched, to return to the moon, and of course in the longer term, Mars and the outer planets and the asteroids. So we're awaiting those milestones, but they are not very far in our future. So that's more than 5, but it gives you a kind of a capsule history of the internet's evolution.
Thank you for capturing the history and evolution of the internet in a capsule, and also giving a peek into the future technologies such as quantum computing and interplanetary internet. It is intriguing how these things come about. What do you think are the forces behind their emergence? Rather, what or how they came about?
One wonderful point to be made here is that while Bob and I started this work now nearly 50 years ago, almost precisely 50 years ago, come to think of it,
Yeah.
we were joined by many people who caught the same excitement that we had, that this might be possible to do, to build a network of computers that didn't matter what brand they were or where they were anywhere in the world, that they could all interact with each other. And so connectivity was the primary focus of attention here. And interestingly enough, we're seeing erosion of that as people are concerned about harmful behaviors on the internet. Some of them want to disconnect somehow. But just like the telephone system, connectivity is everything. In the internet world, the value of being able to connect any pair of computers together is what makes the internet so unique. And for the same reasons that we don't ever disconnect the telephone system, or we try not to, even in times of great conflict, well, the internet needs to stay connected as well. Otherwise, its value erodes very quickly. One of our number, Robert Metcalfe, the inventor of the Ethernet, coined Metcalfe's law, which said the value of the internet grew as the square of the number of things connected to it. And that could be either computers or people or both. And although there are arguments about whether it's really n squared or n log n, it's still a very appreciable value gain. And we don't want to lose that, in spite of the fact that we know there are risks associated with this internet environment and the World Wide Web that sits on top of it. And we need to counter those threats, but we need to do that in a way that doesn't lose connectivity and in a way that preserves human rights and protects people from harm. So it's a challenge. But it's a worthwhile challenge to meet because the value of the internet lies in the heart of its universal connectivity.
So the major motivation or force behind internet is connectivity. Connecting the devices and the people is the major value proposition of the internet. Is that right, Vin?
I think so, because you don't know, when we were first doing this work, we didn't know what applications would emerge. But we knew that, and as a result, we knew that you didn't know which pairs of computers or which groups of computers would most usefully be interconnected. Remember, this was being developed initially as the backbone of what we thought might become the command and control network for the American military. And in that context, it wasn't clear what sorts of applications would emerge, but we knew they would all benefit from connectivity, especially considering if you're out in the field and you don't have access to computer power that you want to manage your resources, which may be back, in the continental US, you need to be able to connect to get access to those computing resources. Now, over time, the computing resources have dispersed, have become much more distributed. But we've also seen concentrations of computing capability in the form of data centers, which could be anywhere, and you want to be able to connect to them to get access to your data and to get access to computational power. So once again, this connectivity was so fundamental to the value that it needs to be preserved. That was true 50 years ago, and it's true today as well. And the irony of all this is that even though we were doing this for the American Defense Department, we immediately realized that the allies of the US at that time and at any time would need to have access to the same technology in order to be able to participate in the command and control system. You want your allies to make use of the same capacity. And so they had to know how to make it work, which is why we released the design publicly, and we didn't try to close it up and classify it or even patent it. We wanted no barriers to the uptake of this technology. And indeed, I think we were right in that decision, because here we are today. Roughly 2/3 of the world's population does have direct access to the internet, and we hope the remaining third will have access soon.
Thank you. Now, moving from the past to the future, do you think singularity is near us, as some believe? As you know, there are some believers of singularity and transhumanism. What are your thoughts on singularity?
So Ray Kurzweil is a good friend. He's also a colleague at Google, and we've had many conversations on this topic. Ray has been very good about predicting a number of things that are related to the rapid growth of computational capability, and often quotes the number of neurons in the brain is becoming similar to the number of computers in the internet. And does that mean the singularity is near? I think that I don't entirely agree with that because I think the connectivity of the brain is probably even more important than the number of neurons that are in it. And so again, connectivity becomes the critical value. I haven't seen evidence yet that the singularity is really near merely on the basis of number of computing cycles that are available. One could argue that the machine learning world is looking increasingly as if there is a singularity, but I want to emphasize that what we are seeing there is the simulation of human discourse. And I want to emphasize simulation, although it sometimes looks as if these machine learning systems are reasoning and that they somehow have models of the way the world works. I think those models are actually dimly reflected in the statistics of text, which has been ingested into the system in the course of training the machine learning models, the large language models. And so we're seeing the verisimilitude of intelligent conversation, but it is in some ways thin, and that it's not based on fundamental models of the way the world works. These systems are not perceiving the real world. They are only getting the, I would say, the reflection of the real world as it shows in discourse, in human discourse, in texts that have been created by humans. And so even though it's very tempting to imagine that that's an indicator of the singularity being near, I think it is not. So I am still skeptical at this point. However, I do want to emphasize that these systems do have enormous power as tools that can be employed by human beings in useful ways. And so even if the singularity doesn't happen, these kinds of tools can be extremely helpful in discovering information we might not otherwise find. And so in some ways, you see the similarity between the search engines that Google and others operate and the ability of a large language model to have captured information. I don't know whether we're going to talk more about large language models, but if we are going to, I'll hold off on a couple of other comments. If we are not, then I have a few other observations to make about those large language models, which I think are worthy of attention.
Thank you so much for sharing your views on singularity. Though I did not mention Ray Kurzweil, I was thinking of him since he was your colleague at Google. Is he still there?
He is still at Google.
Okay. Okay. Coming back to AI, we are supposedly still in the narrow AI stage. Artificial General Intelligence, AGI, is said to be around the corner. Do you think we are close to or near super intelligence?
I don't think so if by super intelligence we imagine comparable human intellect. Humans have the ability to formulate models on the basis of very small amounts of input. An example that I often use is a table. A table is a very simple concept. It's a horizontal surface which is perpendicular to the gravitational field. Of course, most people never think of it in exactly those terms, but even a 2-year-old can figure out what a table can do. They know that they have an object with a flat bottom. It stays on the table. It doesn't roll off. But then they soon discover that other things can be tables. For example, a box can be a table, a chair can be a table, even your lap can be a table. And this concept is rapidly understood by a 2-year-old. it's not 100% clear that we have artificial intelligence that recognizes that kind of fact and can generalize from it. It doesn't matter what the shape of the table is, doesn't matter what its color is, doesn't matter what material it was made out of. All that matters is it's a flat surface perpendicular to the gravitational field. So I think we're still some distance away from that kind of understanding. However, we have shown remarkable narrow ability to understand things that even humans are not exactly sure why they work. An example of this comes out of DeepMind, which is a sister company in the Alphabet system, sister to Google. And recently, they trained one of their neural networks to learn how to predict what the folding of proteins would be for all the various proteins that might be made from human DNA. And that was 200 million proteins. And they practiced with human beings playing at a puzzle. How could this fold up, and what do we know about the actual structure? How do we predict what other protein folding would look like? And they managed to show an algorithm for some 80,000 proteins. Then they applied that algorithm to all of the DNA, known DNA in the human genetic sequence, and produced the folding of the 200 million proteins that could be produced. And the reason that's so important is that we never would have done that, I think, at human scale without the assistance of the artificial intelligence neural network. And the second thing that's important is, having done that, we now know what those proteins are and how they're shaped. And that means we know something about how they might interact with other proteins and other parts of the body. And that might lead to medical breakthroughs. It might lead to treatments of various kinds. And we couldn't do that without the capacity of these large language models or the neural networks. So these are tools, and they are augmenting of human capability, something that Douglas Engelbart articulated passionately in the 1950s, along with J.C.R. Licklider at MIT. And so those two giants in our field foresaw the possibility that computers could augment human intellect, and they have, and they do, and they will. But whether that turns into superintelligence, I think, is still an open debate. But it will enable humans to do things that they couldn't otherwise do. Another example of this in the large language model space is natural language translation, the ability to take text and translate from one language to another. And while it isn't perfect, it's strikingly useful and improving over time. And that is an enabling thing. I'm language disabled. I don't speak Farsi. I don't speak Hindi. And yet, if I receive texts in those languages, I can turn to Google Translate and get at least an idea of what the text is trying to say. And that expands my capacity to deal with non-English languages, for instance. And so that's an empowering capability.
Yeah, true that. I too use Google Translate not only for Indian languages, but other languages too. We have come a long way in machine translation. Some of these technologies are truly enabling and empowering. Some of these technologies not only augment but also repair human intelligence or capabilities. What are your views on BCI, brain computer interface, which augments, assists, and repairs cognitive as well as neuromotor functions by establishing a direct communication pathway between the brain's electrical activity and a computer or robotic limb? An area, incidentally, which had its origins at UCLA and also supported by DARPA and others.
So this is really interesting. I have a personal example of this because my wife has 2 cochlear implants. Mm-hmm. And this is a sensory neural system in which a speech processor takes in sound from a microphone. It does a Fourier transform to figure out which frequencies are present in the speech utterance. or the sound input. And then it figures out which electrodes that have been implanted in the cochlea should be stimulated in order to persuade the brain that it's hearing. And in order to do this, you have to understand what the signal input produces in the normal human brain and the auditory system. What are the nerve signals that the brain detects upon the arrival of certain sounds and frequencies and also amplitudes. So this is a mechanical system, effectively, that is convincing the brain that it has a sensory neural capability that it no longer has from the biology. In my wife's case, it was spinal meningitis, and she had a very high temperature, and it destroyed the ciliary hairs inside the cochlea, which normally move in synchrony with the incoming frequencies, the long hairs with the low frequencies and the short hairs for the higher ones. And as they move, they generate electrical signals that the brain interprets as sound. So this is a construct, an artificial construct that reproduces those signals. I think that sensory neural implants are going to be increasingly feasible, including for sight as well as sound. And we're even starting to see some efforts at haptic interfaces. I'm not so sure about smell and taste. I think that's a more complicated problem. And I would also say that sensory motor capability is also becoming increasingly feasible, where perhaps someone with a loss of a limb but still has neural capability. The neurons, for sensory motor neurons, can be stimulated by brain thinking, and then that stimulus detected and reproduced and in an artificial hand or artificial arm or leg and what have you. So I think sensory motor and sensory neural things are directly understandable by us. We can measure those, we can detect them. Now, you actually, though, are asking about cognitive implants. And here I think I am very skeptical. And the reason for this is that we do not understand thought. We do not understand where a concept is in the brain. We know that it's probably somehow distributed in the connectome, but it's groups of neurons that form thought to the best of our current ability to even model this. I think we're very, very far away from being able to do anything like a memory implant that would help me a lot, for example. However, there are some surprising things that we can do. You've heard about the syndrome of someone being locked in, where they cannot speak. Maybe they can't even move their arms or their eyelids or anything. And yet they're still there. They're still alive. They're still thinking. They just can't make their presence known. However, it turns out that when you are speaking, all kinds of signals go to the muscle system in order to generate the speech that you intend. And so there is this raft of sensory motor signals that are produced. If, in fact, even when you deliberately do not utter something, those signals may still be present. You just don't allow them to activate the muscles. You close your mouth and you keep thinking, but you're not saying what you're thinking. The interesting possibility is that you might still sense the sensory motor signals associated with speech. And you might therefore, with the appropriate implants, allow someone who cannot speak to actually be heard, because we could detect the intentional signals to the motor complex, even if those muscles don't actually move. And so that kind of possibility is quite exciting, but it's still far away from the notion of being able to detect, understand, or signal thought. So I think we just don't know enough yet to do that. And also the connectivity that would be required for such an implant is extreme, especially if it isn't concentrated in one small part of the brain. What if, in order to do this sort of artificial cognitive stimulus, you need to have this collection of connectors scattered throughout the brain? Well, that's very invasive. And I don't think there's any one place where you can put those sorts of interfaces, as opposed to seeing, which has an optical nerve, or hearing, which has an auditory nerve, or motor signals, which are physically concentrated at the places where the muscles are to be stimulated. So it's a lot easier to do that than it is to design something with cognitive capacity.
So, what you're saying is when it comes to BCI, perhaps specialized applications, say for the eye or for the ear, to augment our hearing or a success. But we are farther away from achieving success or going anywhere near generic applications for augmenting the brain. Is that what you are saying?
Absolutely. I mean, with the cochlear implant being now standard therapy as opposed to experimental as it was 25 years ago, is an example. And ocular implants have been attempted and have had some, I use the word success very, very lightly here, but they have shown evidence of possibilities. So, and the same argument could be made for spinal implants in order to get past a break or an impairment in the spinal cord, which might inhibit movement. I mean, you could be paraplegic or hemiplegic or quadriplegic. We might be able to repair that by pushing the signals from the brain past the place where the spine has been injured to reactivate sensory motor stimulus. So I'm very excited about that. I believe those are all within the realm of possibility and certainly within the next decade.
The incredible advancements in AI technologies have brought hope and despair about the future. You have already mentioned briefly many of the positive applications of AI. Can you share and elaborate more on the power of AI to transform lives? For example, let us say, do you think it can bring healthcare to all? Do you think it can be a panacea for many of our problems today, whether poverty alleviation or cybersecurity?
So there are two things that remote medicine has been a dream for many, and in India in particular, that's an important notion because in the rural parts of India, often we don't have access to doctors and hospitals and things. In order for remote medicine to work, of course, we need connectivity, which we talked about earlier. We need more internet capability everywhere. We also need the ability to do medical sensing locally. And ironically, mobile phones are starting to show a certain capacity for being remote medical sensors. I mean, we can sense breathing. We can use the cameras with suitable attachments to examine the eye, to look at lesions and so on. There are other kinds of sensors that a watch, for example, that can sense blood pressure and sense pulse rates and so on, pulse ox. And so as we develop more and more devices that are capable of doing local sensing, that is very useful for remote diagnosis, for example. That doesn't even necessarily require any artificial intelligence, although in many cases, the ability to accurately sense something does require application of neural networks in order to filter out noise from the signal in order to detect what you're looking for. So a combination of artificial intelligence, machine learning, and remote sensing could bring a substantial improvement in healthcare. I don't think I would go so far as to argue that we could do remote surgery using robotic equipment, but I have to tell you, it's been attempted. I would not want to be the first person to be, testing remote surgery over the internet out of concern that if the internet breaks, then the surgery goes awry, and that would be scary. However, the other kinds of advice giving and remote diagnosis, I think, are entirely feasible. So I'm looking forward to that happening, but it can only happen if, for example, we get reliable sources of electricity so that we can run our laptops and desktops and mobiles and watches and so on. And we get an internet which is highly reliable and has adequate speed and adequate latency, low enough latency for all of these kinds of interactive things to work.
So, moving from the immense possibility to the other side, the darker side, or the dangers of AI, we are entering or soon entering the uncharted territories. Angst is about the loss of human agency. The concern is whether we will retain our power or authority over decision making. People are worried about the clash of two intelligences, artificial and human intelligence, due to the convergence of infotech and biotech. What are your thoughts on the future of human agency? Do you think we will still retain our control over decision making in the age of AI? Do you think we are moving away from the Homo sapiens to Homo deus, as author Yuval Harari puts it?
So it's a very interesting concern, and it's a choice that we can make. I mean, this is not some inevitable problem. The use of artificial intelligence, as we talked about before, can be highly beneficial. It's an empowering capability. On the other hand, we also know that it doesn't always work. And the fact that it doesn't work always means that we should not give over autonomy to these artificially intelligent systems. Sometimes this is called human in the loop. And I have to say that that view is only partly achievable, because there is some situations where response times are required that are way below the response times of humans. And so you may need automated systems that have response times on the order of nanoseconds or microseconds, which human beings can't offer. But in those cases where autonomy is needed because of the response time requirement, extreme testing is required to make sure that the neural network is proof against failure, is sufficient proof against failure. So I would sort of rank order the applications of neural networking according to risk. So an example of a very high risk is one which is an artificial intelligence or a machine learning system which is giving you medical advice. I would want to be assured that a substantial amount of effort has gone into making sure that the advice is valid. You could imagine spot checking the advice by having doctors consider what the advice is under a wide range of conditions. All kinds of validation and testing and the like required for these high risk kinds of applications. We shouldn't use artificial intelligence and give it autonomy unless we have very high degree of assurance that it will work as intended. Just to give you an example of how easy it is for a machine learning system to go awry, especially in the large language models, I tried something just as a test. I said to one of the large language models, chatbots, write me an obituary for Vint Cerf. And I know that sounds kind of negative, but the reason I chose that is that I knew that there was a lot of information on the internet about me, and so these chatbots will have ingested a huge amount of that off the World Wide Web. And second, obituaries are a very common form. People die every day. We write obituaries about them, and they're out on the net. And so I assumed that the training for the large language models will have encountered both facts about Vint Cerf and obituary format. So the chatbot wrote an obituary, but it was in the usual form. We're sorry to tell you that Vint Cerf passed away, and then some factoids about my life history. But the system attributed to me things that I did not do, and it gave credit to other people for things I did. And so it confused and conflated fact. And you might ask, well, why did that happen? And I did ask, why did that happen? And I came to the belief that even when you train these large language models on factual information, they chop it all up into tokens which you can think of as small, short phrases of text. And the way they operate, of course, is to glue tokens together, one after the other. And what the preamble determines what the high probability next token is going to be. And it produces the text that way, based on all the probabilities of high value next token. So I imagine for a moment, I don't know if your listeners will know what a product called a salad shooter is, but it's a little device which has a chopper in it. And you put a carrot in and it chops the carrot all up and sprays it into a salad bowl. And it does the same with the lettuce and all the other things that go into a nice salad. So imagine for the moment that truth is a vegetable and you stick it into the salad shooter and it chops it all up into little, pieces, sprays them into the bowl, you toss all the salad and then you serve somebody. Well, the problem there is that the facts get conflated with each other in a way which is wrong. And the system doesn't know that. And so even when you train on fact, it may produce non-fact. It may produce misinformation. And so that's important because if, in fact, we recognize that, then we have to be very careful about what to do with the output from these large language models. Effectively, they tell untruths. So now we have to ask ourselves, well, how can we tell? And in fact, it's hard. One thing that is common in another domain and in the art world is something called provenance. Who has owned it? Who painted the painting? Who has owned the painting? To whom has it been handed off over time? We need provenance of the information that goes into these large language models. I'm not quite sure how we do this little token is a phrase of a few words long. How do we assign provenance to that? Because it could come from 1,000 different websites, the same phrase showing up. And so just referencing the website where the phrase came from may not necessarily tell us anything. But somehow we have to find a way of speaking to the provenance of the output that we see from these large language models. Now, let me give you a more scary thought for a moment, just because we're talking about why we should be concerned about these things. The fact that we can interact with a chatbot using text and even speech, and the systems can understand speech and they can have text to speech generated. So you could have a conversation with a chatbot in the most literal sense. Now, why should we be concerned about that? Well, because we are building application programming interfaces that allow for text and speech interaction with programs. That means that programs can be driven by textual exchange, which means a chatbot could drive a program using a speech or text API. That means the chatbot could make something happen because it could tell another application to do something. And the application could respond and the chatbot could be interacting with it to make something happen. So suddenly the chatbot, because of its ability to deal with natural language, can affect the real world because we allowed it to do that. We allowed it to interact with APIs that enable this. And now we should be worried about which things we allow a chatbot to exercise. What functions is it permitted to do? And again, we're back to this sort of risk tableau. For high risk kinds of applications, we should be very stringent about making sure that these large language models don't wander off into dangerous spaces. For the low risk stuff like just entertainment, it's fine as long as you understand that the chatbot may be producing fiction and that you shouldn't trust whatever it has to say other than to be amused by it. But when you get into applications where it's actually causing something to happen, either by giving advice or taking a specific action, we should be concerned about that.
Yeah, true that. My own interactions and experience with ChatGPT has not been that great. While it is pretty good, I would say impressive at many questions, it messes up some factors and also some questions, gets it totally wrong. So, as you said, we have to be concerned about the truth factor or the veracity of the chat GPT output. We need to be concerned about its impact, particularly its ability to generate text. It's okay, as you said, for entertainment. But when it comes to facts and figures, when it comes to opinions, we have to be little more concerned. While the current race to win the generative AI, next generation of generative AI is good in a sense. However, the worry is that when the race hots up, as it has now, companies, say for example, such as Microsoft or Google, will lower their guardrails and compromise on their responsible AI programs and efforts. What are your thoughts on the same, Ben?
Well, at Google, we've adopted an artificial intelligence guardrail mantra and a set of guidelines for when and how we apply artificial intelligence, either narrow or broad. And we try very hard to both apply those constraints and restrictions and those principles, and often also to refine them in order to deal with the potential risk. And it would be nice if all the companies in the world who are using these tools would apply similar kinds of thoughtful principles to protect against harm. However, competition can sometimes lead to kind of an unbridled reduction of guardrails. And so that gets back to the notion of accountability and the importance of holding companies accountable for their use of these technologies, especially in areas where risk might be high. And so once you're seeing lawmakers in various parts of the world attempt to adopt legislation that will provide incentive for companies to constrain their use of these technologies to safe engagement. And so I think that we will see over the period of the next several years a great deal of attention paid to how we constrain the use of these technologies in order to make them safer, or at least not to expose people to unnecessary risk. Without doubt, there will be situations where harm has occurred, and then there will be questions of liability and accountability. But I do hope that people recognize the importance of protecting against bad outcomes.
That's right. Accountability is of critical importance. Companies, lawmakers, and everyone need to work together towards creating safe technologies, or at least minimize the risk factors. Without safety features, the incredible AI technologies are going to bring disaster or take us closer to dystopia. The world as we know it is facing its existential crisis with worries about democracy in crisis, especially due to the misinformation and the disinformation phenomena. Society has moved from being at the mercy of or directed by the all knowing and all powerful Almighty to algorithms. Is the tech world doing everything in its power to let humans and free will and free choice be the authority and not the algorithms? Whether we are making decisions about whom to vote for, what to buy, or whatever the issue is.
We're back to this question about the validity of algorithmic recommendations, for example, and understanding the mechanisms by which the algorithms work. In theory, should give us a clue about when and how to trust the recommendations or the validations or valuations that the algorithms generate. And I think we should have a healthy skepticism about the validity of some of these algorithmic outcomes, which means a lot of testing and a lot of recourse in the event that an algorithm fails to produce an appropriate output. It's the recourse and accountability, I think, that need to be reinforced for potential hazards. in the use of these mechanisms. And that's why legislation is important as we work our way through understanding these tools and knowing what their limitations are. And if companies choose to use the algorithms in ways that turn out to be harmful, and that's exposed, then there should be liability and accountability for that. And that's why the legislation, although it's very difficult and it's well intended, but it's easy to get the legislation wrong too. So we need to think very hard about how to create a safer environment where these algorithms can be very useful, but also potentially hazardous. And again, we're back to accountability, I think.
So we are back to the accountability factor. Regulations and legislations to ensure safety and accountability are the way forward.
I want to be careful that it's understood that just because you write a regulation doesn't necessarily mean it's implementable. And so one of the things that we need is to work with legislators, the technical community needs to work with legislators in order to be assured that the intent of the legislation or regulation is implementable. Because you can simply say, we don't want an algorithm that causes harm. And if that's the legislation, there's no hint about how to implement that. And it may not be implementable in that form. And so we really need to have a partnership between the legislators, the regulators, and the technology community in order to know how to say what those regulations should be and how to implement them in a way that is effective. There needs to be a partnership there. It can't simply be the legislators making a declaration. It's a little bit like having a piece of legislation that says nobody in India should starve, and we would all agree with that. And well, how are we going to achieve that? It says, well, we should subsidize people's income who can't afford food. Okay, that sounds like a good idea. Then the next question will be, okay, so who gets how much subsidy? And what's the basis for that decision? Well, now you have to start deciding, okay, so what's the right income level and what's the compensation that should be, or subsidy that should be provided? There are a lot of details that have to be worked out. So it's not enough to say, our legislation says nobody should starve. When you start getting into the regulations, you get down into the how do I implement it? And that's important for the legislators and the regulators to understand, that you have to get to implementation in order to succeed.
So you are saying before we legislate, we need to have conversations and collaborations between policymakers, corporations, and others. So the need of the hour is the moonshot thinking to solve the current wicked problems, whether it is climate change or the dystopian future lurking around the corner. Do you believe that we can power through these crises and emerge the winner to avoid a dystopian future? Are regulations the answer? Or do you think there could be some engineering solutions? Looking back, would you have designed the internet, that is TCP/IP, differently?
I don't think so. I mean, there are a few things that I wish I could have done. version 4 had an insufficient address space. We know that today. We didn't know that 50 years ago. And I don't think anyone 50 years ago would have agreed that we needed whatever it is, 3.4 times 10 to the 38th addresses in order to try this idea out. It was an experiment 50 years ago. It wasn't clear it was going to work. We had enough address space to handle something like 4.3 billion terminations in an experimental network. And I thought, surely that's enough for an experiment, over the next several years. In fact, the IP version 4 format escaped into public use around 1989 or so. And the result of that was that we exhausted the address space somewhere around 2011. And we found little tricks to play using network address translation in order to keep the IP version 4 still useful and running. but we really need to move over to IPv6. But I don't think I could have convinced myself, let alone anyone else, of that. And there are always questions about cryptography and security. And again, I don't think injecting that into the early internet and demanding that everyone follow those kinds of rules would have made much sense, because the community that was using and building the internet were mostly graduate students, and they're not the first place you would turn to discipline with regard to cryptographic keys. So I don't regret any of the decisions we've made leading up to the present, but I also believe there are lots more decisions that do need to be made, and need to be made in context of the known hazards that the internet might impose.
Yeah, you had mentioned about provenance and trust earlier also. Do you think we can inject provenance and trust features into the internet of the future?
Possibly. There is a great deal of attention being paid right now to identity and strong authentication. And so knowing the origins of content, for example, is very important. And being able to validate that in a strong way that's not forgeable is important. And I think that's one of the next major shifts in the internet development, is going to be strong authentication and strong cryptographic protections, digital signatures, and the like. Now, some people will say, oh, that's blockchain. And I will say, no, that's not necessarily blockchain. And I am still somewhat of a skeptic about the utility of blockchain. There are some things that match well with that functionality, but there are all kinds of questions about the rate at which transactions can be handled in the blockchain environment. There are questions about permissioned and non-permissioned blockchains and anonymous blockchains, and whether or not they're really trustable. There are all kinds of open questions in my mind about that. But I do think that strong authentication and identity are going to be key to enhancing the safety and security of the online environment.
Vint, you had also mentioned earlier about the interplanetary internet. You have been part of the interplanetary internet team at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory and undertook the interplanetary internet study along with late Adrian Cook. Can you share with our viewers some of the challenges and opportunities there?
I'd be happy to. The project started in 1998 at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. A bunch of us got together to celebrate the successful Mars landing of the Pathfinder project and the little rover that went with it, the Sojourner rover. And as we met and discussed that success on Mars, we asked ourselves, what should we be doing 25 years, that will be needed 25 years later? Well, here it is 25 years later, and we concluded back then that we should be thinking about how to design and build an interplanetary backbone. And we very quickly discovered that the speed of light delay is extremely significant. We don't notice it much here on Earth because the distances that the signals travel are fairly short. But between Earth and Mars, we are between 35 million and 235 million miles apart in our respective orbits. Speed of light delay for those distances is anywhere from 3.5 minutes to 20 minutes. And of course, the round trip times are double that. So we've ended up realizing that we have a variably delayed and also disrupted communication environment. Planets are rotating. You can't talk to something on the surface until it comes back around. Same with orbiting satellites. To say nothing of planets going behind the sun, and you can't talk to each other unless you have an alternate route around the sun. So we've developed a whole new suite of protocols. They have been running, prototypes have been running on Mars, between Earth and Mars, since 2004. We've been running the most recent versions of the protocols on the International Space Station and terrestrially. They've been standardized by the Consultative Committee on Space Data Systems and by the Internet Engineering Task Force. It is hoped that they will be on board for the subsequent Artemis missions 2 and 3, so that when we do return to the moon, there will be a standard for interplanetary communication that we can exercise in anticipation of what's going to be needed going to Mars. There are some people who imagine that the TCP/IP protocols might still work between Earth and the Moon, and the answer is they might. The time variation there is about 2.5 seconds, but that's very different from 7 minutes to 40 minutes or more, depending on how far out into the solar system you go. So I think that I'm hoping, frankly, that we don't get distracted by the possibility of running the conventional internet protocols on the moon, only to discover that they don't work between Earth and Mars, and instead run the interplanetary protocols designed specifically to deal with that. And that's the direction I think we're headed in right now. The interesting thing about all of this is that NASA has already introduced commercial notions into the return to the moon. They've offered for companies to do mining on the moon. They've offered to purchase the results of the mining, the ore that comes back. And so there's already a business model for operations on the moon that NASA is promoting. And the thing that raises all kinds of questions about ownership. Under the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, you're not supposed to be able to own any territory in the rest of the solar system. I don't think that's not sustainable. At some point, if you really are going to commercialize space travel and the use of space, you have to consider the possibility of ownership. But as soon as you do that, you have to ask, well, where do I register? In which jurisdiction are disputes to resolve? All of those questions are still open, and they will arise very quickly as commercial interests come to the moon and Mars and the other asteroids and the planets. So this need for legislation on a global scale that agrees how we're going to deal with the commercialization of space needs to happen now, because we're going to be confronted with the problem in just a few years' time. So it's fascinating this showed up in the interplanetary backbone network as we realized that parts of it would be supplied by the governments initially, those who are supporting space travel, but eventually commercial sector interests will arise in the same way that the internet went from government sponsored to a commercial activity. The same argument can be made for the interplanetary backbone. At some point, it should become a commercial activity that you can simply purchase. So I'm excited about that, but it's coming very fast, faster than I had anticipated.
So, whether AI or interplanetary internet, we are living the exciting times. So, my final question to you, Vint, is what's your advice to young scientists and engineers working in the technology space? What should they be focusing on?
Well, the simple answer to this might be astrophysics. And the reason I mention that is that in 2023, we know less about the universe than we thought we knew in 1900. We had a Newtonian model, we had physical constants, and we figured if we could measure the physical constants more accurately, we could make good predictions of how the universe was going to unfold. Of course, here in 2023, we don't know anything. We don't know what dark matter is. We don't know what dark energy is. We can't understand entanglement. We barely know what normal matter and antimatter are. And so at this point, if you go into astrophysics, we know so little, you have a high probability of winning the Nobel Prize for anything that you do. However, to be pragmatic about it, not everybody can be an astrophysicist. So I think the other theme that I would emphasize is computational X for almost all values of X. Computational linguistics, biology, physics, chemistry, economics, and so on. Computers are becoming enormously powerful tools. They may become even more powerful with neural networks and quantum computing. And so I would urge attention to be paid to computational possibilities. This isn't to say that we don't also need people that go into law and go into economics and go into finance and go into marketing and sales and engineering and so on. We need all of those in order to take advantage of the continued evolution of technology and the tools that we can use. I will say that one of the most important things I can advise is if you're going to do anything big, get help. especially from somebody smarter than you are. And that's certainly where the internet success has come from. Bob and I got a lot of help from many people who wanted to do the same thing that we did. And the result is apparent.
So it's going to be computational everything. More power to computing. Astrophysics, application of computational techniques across disciplines, and collaborations are the future, according to you. Seeking help and together we can attitude can solve problems and turn most problems solvable. Shall I put it that way?
Well, I hope so. I mean, not all problems are solvable. We learned that in the mathematical realm when we discovered that there is an undecidability theorem that says there are certain kinds of assertions that you cannot decide are either true or false. And so we need to understand the limitations of our technology. But I think we also need to understand how to apply it.
Thank you so much for this opportunity to chat with you. You have been very generous with your time. May the force be with you for the good of humanity. I hope to meet you in person sometime, somewhere. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Shalini. I appreciate that. And if we don't meet in person, surely we'll meet on the net.
Yes, at least on the net. On that note, let us say bye. Take care.
Bye for now.